If a bear is anything, it is hungry. Bears need to eat a year's worth of food in half a year or less in order to gain the fat reserves necessary to sustain them through winter hibernation. And that fact alone influences much of the behavior that we see here at Brooks River in Katmai National Park with brown bears. But when you take a closer look at that behavior, especially how it's driven by hunger and especially how it influences their foraging opportunities to catch salmon, we can see that their fishing behavior, especially when they're trying to catch salmon, highlights their individuality, their adaptability, their ability to exploit opportunity, and how important salmon are to brown bears here. And welcome to this live chat about brown bears and how they fish for salmon. My name is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org. I'm joined today with my co-host, Leon Law from Katmai National Park. Leon, thanks for joining me today.
Always a pleasure, especially in person here.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be back at Brooks River in person. We didn't know if we were going to make it out here today. Both you and I were in King Salmon, about 30 miles away, and the weather was a bit rougher out there than it is right here. But we made it. We're glad to be here. Brooks River's behind us, Dumpling Mountain's behind us. It's turning out to be a really great afternoon here. And again, during the broadcast today, we're going to highlight many of the different fishing behaviors that you can see on the bear cams. We're also going to try to highlight some of the uniqueness of our individual bears and how the salmon are influence the brown bears themselves. But Leon, I think maybe we need to get to some basics at first. Talk perhaps maybe about why brown bears come here to Brooks River in the first place, and how just getting back to basics, what they're doing.
Sure. So much of a bear's life is dominated by the search for food and the need to pack on those pounds, again, in that short amount of time. And when you think about Katmai, specifically Brooks Camp as well, there is perhaps no better place to be a brown bear because of the sheer abundance of food. And we are talking specifically about sockeye salmon here. And this place has one of the strongest runs in the world. It's a really healthy ecosystem. But we also have to look at the dynamics of Brooks Falls in particular. So when you think about Brooks Falls, right, it's a 6-foot high waterfall that spans the entire river. And compared to any other national park, right, this waterfall really is truly modest when you think about Yellowstone or Yosemite. But for sockeye salmon who are moving upstream, that 6-foot high wall is truly a daunting obstacle. And so as they are jumping up there, often there'll be a backlog of salmon in the river. And sometimes those salmon, they'll fill the river bank to bank, essentially. So it almost looks like there's more salmon than river. Maybe not in this picture here, but during the peak season, that can definitely be the case. And when you think about last year's run too, that is definitely something we saw. And so these high concentrations of fish make for relatively easy fishing for bears. And so that's why those bears are drawn here, and especially in large numbers as well. And I know that if I were a bear, I would definitely choose this place as my salmon buffet. But Mike, even though there is an abundance of food, right, it still takes a lot of effort to eat all of those calories that are necessary. Can you talk about how bears maximize their effort here?
It is a lot about the choices that they make, in my opinion. It does go back to the fact that they're really eating to survive winter hibernation. So they're not eating just to make up for their daily calorie needs, but they need to make a huge amount of profit before they go into the den, essentially. So we can also, when we're watching the fishing behavior of brown bears, we can take a look at the economics of it. And I'm not going to do the math on this, right now, although it can be quite fascinating to kind of tease that out. But bears make a lot of foraging choices when they're fishing for salmon. And one of the things that they really look for is to maximize their profit in calories as best as they can. That could be just by eating a lot of fish in a day, for instance. But when bears are especially well fed, that also means that they're eating and making foraging decisions about what parts of the fish that they want to eat. Because the sockeye salmon isn't just a uniform bundle of energy. Energy, as far as calories, is scattered throughout the individual fish. So it's especially fat, and bears are so good at digesting fat. Uh, that I think is perhaps maybe best defined or well known or described, I should say, from polar bears. But really, it's brown bears are really, really good at digesting fat as well. And when you're looking at calories and reward before they go into the den, eating the fattiest parts of the fish is definitely worthwhile. So that's something that you can watch for when bears are really well fed. Like right now, they're just catching the first salmon of the year, so they're much more likely than anything else to eat the whole fish. But as we start to see higher concentrations and greater numbers of salmon at Brooks River, we're going to start to see bears high grading the fish, as we like to call it. So eating the skin, eating the brains, eating the eggs. I mean, the eggs are just nothing but fish oil themselves. Highly digestible, really high in calories. So that is a specific choice that they happen to be making when they're doing that. So when you're watching bears fishing in the river, consider those choices that they're making. It's not only that they're eating salmon and they're choosing to eat salmon, because there's a lot of food in the park for brown bears, but salmon really are the most important food for these animals. But it's also those choices that they make about the individual parts of the fish. And Leon, also where they're fishing in the river as well. Those are also choices that we'll see the bears making.
Definitely. There's a lot of different locations where we can see bears fish here, and it's pretty unique in the different varied opportunities as well. But whether you are new to Katmai, have never been before, or you are new to the bear camps, we'll talk about a few of those places. We'll start at the falls. There are three main places that we generally talk about. The Lip is definitely one of those places. If you have only ever seen one picture of Katmai, most likely it's going to be a picture of a bear standing at the lip of the waterfalls catching a salmon mid-air, and that can be a really productive place, but it also probably takes a little more skill than most people realize. So later on we will elaborate a little bit more on that and have a short video on the skill that it really takes to fish the lip. Another area that we talk about pretty frequently is the far pool. And the far pool is on the far side of the river. It is the furthest from the viewing platform. You can definitely see it there, and oftentimes it might be a place where we get bears who are less tolerant of people, since it is further away from that viewing platform. Another place that we frequently talk about, oh, and this is a great picture actually from that side of the far pool to give you a different perspective than you might not normally see from the viewing platform itself. But another place, again, that we talk about often at the falls is the jacuzzi. And that jacuzzi area is a plunge pool. It is below the falls there, and it can be a really productive place for bears to catch a lot of salmon at one time. And it's interesting here because bears really aren't using their sense of sight at all. There's too much aeration in the water, so they're waiting for the fish to kind of bump into them, and then they'll pin them there. They'll stick their head in and they'll pull that fish out. And when you think about it, if you look at it there, it's pretty impressive how some of the larger bears can really hold their weight there and stand their ground, because there's a lot of force to that water. And so it's always fun to see some of those larger bears like 747 or 856 in the jacuzzi, especially when you look at some of the subadults and maybe younger bears who they hold their weight differently in the jacuzzi. Further downstream from the falls, about 100 yards or so, we have the riffles area. And so this is a really good place to perhaps see some bears utilize different fishing techniques than at the falls, and then also some bears who may not be able to hold some of those really productive spots at the falls itself. We might see a lot of sows with cubs, or perhaps subadults. Even further down the river, though, about 3/4 of a mile from the falls itself, is the lower river, where Mike and I are standing here today. And it's where the Brooks River meets Naknek Lake, and it can be an excellent place, again, to see lots of bears fish. Bears definitely fish here in July, but when speaking about productivity and when it's a really good time, late fall, this place becomes especially important. After those salmon have made their way upstream, they've spawned, oftentimes they will kind of float back down river here to the lower river. And in fall, this can be a really great place because of the slower waters and a lot of the different eddies too, for bears to patrol the area for dead and dying salmon right before they head into hibernation or head in for the winter. But when you think about location, right? Why is location important? It tells us a lot of different things, actually. So location is important because different locations can be more productive. Different locations are also really highlight different ways of fishing. And then in addition, bears, like people, they are individuals. They can develop habits and preferences, and sometimes we'll see bears year after year come back to the same locations, and it can help us identify them. So yes, we do identify bears definitely by physical characteristics, but behavioral as well. And location is definitely one of those things that plays into it. Um, and it also can talk to us about dominance and hierarchy. Some of those more productive locations may be held by more dominant bears because they can hold those spots. And dominance and hierarchy is something that definitely deserves a whole chat on in itself. And so next week, Naomi and Mike Fitz will also be talking about that on July 7th. So be sure to tune into that one as well. But in terms of location, yes, very important. But technique is too when you think about it, right, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get to talking about techniques, one thing I forgot to mention though is if people want to submit questions for us, you can go ahead and do that. Drop those in the comments right now below the live camera feed on explore.org, and a helpful moderator will be sending those in our direction. So we thank you for submitting those in advance. We'll try to get to a few of those towards the end of the broadcast. But yeah, definitely location is extremely important. We along the river, there's a lot of decent places to fish, or at least there's a few really choice places to fish is perhaps more accurate. But bears, you know, there's a limited number of those spots. I mean, if you really want to make a living and you really want to do it well catching salmon here at Brooks Falls, it seems like you kind of have to target certain areas. And bears are not only partitioning themselves, you know, kind of across these different locations in the river, but they're also partitioning themselves on an individual level by the different techniques that they happen to use. And one of those that we're going to go through kind of a list of them right now, but there's an uncommon one. I think we're going to start with the one that is maybe the least common, the one that we did see a lot more of last year than in previous years. I don't know if I've ever seen bears doing this as much as we did last year, but diving is one of those uncommon techniques that can be very rewarding for bears.
It definitely can. Yeah, from perhaps the least used technique that we see is this complete submersion of the bear. And whether we don't see it that much because it's a technique that bears don't learn, or perhaps it's a technique that they don't prefer either. Again, talking about the individuality of bears. Or perhaps it's a technique that is just simply difficult. For us, we want our bears to be fat, and they want to be fat too. And more fat equals more buoyant. So it really can be a difficult technique. Sometimes we'll see it in the jacuzzi is a great place, like 402, or definitely last year we saw it in the lower river. We saw Bear 27 using this technique quite frequently. And it's always something fun to see because it is definitely one of those least techniques, least used.
And I think that those clips that we're showing, probably many of those were probably number 27 doing that. Not where we're standing, but directly across the river. So if you're watching the River Watch camera, that's going to be the spot to look for maybe that behavior later in the year if there's a bunch of dead salmon in a deep pool there.
Yeah. But moving from perhaps the least used technique to one that is used across the board essentially by all bears, right? Snorkeling and searching. Can you tell us?
Yeah, that's, you know, that's something you're going to see virtually every bear doing at some point in time throughout the summer, sticking their face in the water, looking for anything that really can't swim away, or looking for that, again, that opportunity to pounce on a vulnerable salmon. We'll see it at the falls as bears are waiting for salmon to come to them. We see it probably most often in the lower river area where we're standing right now. Bears will be swimming through this area, again, looking for dead and dying salmon, especially later in the year. They might be looking for some of the more energetic salmon at this time of the year. But when you're looking at the lower river itself, and especially this clip here, you can see just how many avenues of escape the salmon have in this spot. It's really difficult for a bear here to catch a vigorous, healthy fish. The fish just have so many escape options. They can easily swim away from a bear. So this technique, the snorkeling technique, is utilized most often later in the year, although we'll see it happening a lot right now. And for some reason, and maybe this is something that prevents them from actually diving, I don't know, they don't seem to like to get their ears wet. So when they're snorkeling, they're almost always keeping their ears above the water for some reason or another. But they're looking under the water for anything that can't swim away at that time, and that's a very efficient fishing behavior, so to speak, because they're moving slowly. They're very buoyant. Even at this time of the year, they still float pretty well. So they don't have to expend a lot of energy moving through the river looking for fish in that manner. But there's another fishing that we're going to see at this time of the year, especially because there's a lot of hungry bears around. The fish are just showing up, and uh, it's a much more energetic fishing technique.
Yes, and that's the dash and grab, or basically chasing there. And it really is a pretty active technique. So essentially, bears they charge in for a specific fish, and this clip here of 708 Amelia, I do believe, from last year really demonstrates that. And you'll see that they can do it with great precision too at times, and you can just see them do this over and over, and it's really pretty incredible to see that, because it really highlights their prowess at that, but also their skill and their reflexes. So it's always really fun to see some of those more active techniques as well. And but kind of moving from that to one that is also active, but people might see a little less savory.
Yeah, and that's pirating or stealing. It's a legitimate fishing technique for brown bears. We see this quite a bit early in the salmon run. So right now is definitely the time to look for this behavior. This is a clip actually from a few years ago of Lefty coming to steal Otis's fish. And Lefty's a big bear cam favorite right now. But if he continued this behavior and stole fish from very bear cam favorite Otis, I'm not sure that he would be so popular among our bear cam audience. But if a bear thinks that another bear with a salmon isn't going to pose much of a physical threat, then it's going to take its fish. Lefty did that frequently several years ago. He's much less likely to do that, I think, right now, but that's maybe something to watch for when he arrives at the river, because he comes back super hungry every year. And so watch for that with him. Popeye has a tendency to do that as well, and we know Popeye's been at the river this year so far. Chunk used to do that when he was a younger bear, not so much anymore, but you know, bears don't forget these tricks, these behaviors that allow them to survive. So it's definitely a technique that in the human world of things we wouldn't say is appropriate, but from a bear's perspective, it certainly can be a very legitimate, although risky, fishing technique overall. And maybe the one that we'll see the most though this summer, especially in July at Brooks Falls though, is just kind of simply sitting.
Yeah, definitely. Sitting and waiting, or standing and waiting, is a really common technique, and it's something that we'll see a lot at the falls. So think about those locations that we talked about, perhaps the lip, the far pool, the jacuzzi. All of those places are places where these bears utilize that technique. And so they're essentially waiting for the salmon to come to them. And when you think about energy economics, this is really important, right? Because you want to take in more calories than you expend. And so a technique like this can really pay off long term. And if you think about some common bears like 480 over in the far pool, just sitting and waiting, and you know, at times it can almost look lazy, but in reality it is really efficient, really smart overall. So yes, those are all the different places we definitely see it, and it really is productive, especially when there are a lot of salmon. If there's not so many salmon, you probably don't want to just sit there and wait for the salmon to come to you. So during the peak of the salmon run, we definitely see that at the falls. And again, especially at that iconic place, the lip. And so to talk about this technique a little bit more, we do have a short video, I believe, prepared for you guys on the lip itself.
A brown bear stands on the edge of Brooks Falls when a salmon leaps from the foaming water below. The salmon seeks its birthplace upstream and the opportunity to spawn, while the bear seeks to satisfy its great hunger. As the fish jumps through the air, the bear twists her head and neck to match the salmon's trajectory. At the point where they meet, the bear clamps her jaws shut around the salmon. This is one of the most iconic scenes in nature, watched by millions of people each year on explore.org. Yet the ease in which bears can catch leaping salmon can hinder a full appreciation of the event. Fishing the lip of Brooks Falls is no easy task. It is a quintessential demonstration of skill and strength in brown bears. Imagine someone throwing a 5-pound bag of baking flour at your face. You, meanwhile, can only catch it with your teeth. Also imagine that this bag of flour is covered in slippery fish slime. Perhaps you can now begin to understand the difficulty that bears experience when trying to catch salmon on the lip of Brooks Falls. Sockeye salmon are sleek, well-muscled torpedoes. They typically weigh between 4 and 8 pounds. Bears on the lip of Brooks Falls must use all the precision they can muster to catch and hold such slippery, heavy, and fast-moving prey. The topography of the waterfall adds to the challenge. Bears usually must stand at the very precipice of the falls in order to catch leaping salmon. When a bear stands back from the edge, as novice bears sometimes do, then salmon land in front of them and take advantage of the many escape routes upstream. With practice, though, bears learn exactly where to stand so that they find stable footing and are positioned to catch salmon when the fish are most vulnerable. Bears on the lip not only contend with slippery fish and slippery footing, but also with competition from other bears. Every summer, the lip is a choice fishing spot for several adult bears, and it's also one of the few places at the falls where younger bears feel secure enough to test their fishing skills. A hierarchy of lip fishers can develop here, with dominant bears displacing subordinate bears, or tolerant bears queuing for their chance to catch a meal. With footing so precarious, defending space on the lip is sometimes a challenging task. For bears who can secure this fishing spot and perfect the skills to be successful, the reward can be profound. Packed with the fat and protein needed to fuel their upstream migration and spawning efforts, one sockeye salmon can provide a bear with an impressive 4,500 calories. That's the equivalent of eating 15 McDonald's cheeseburgers. But fishing here is not easy. On the lip of Brooks Falls, bears utilize their strength and skill to master a deceivingly difficult task.
You have a good understanding of the skill that is necessary to fish on the lip of Brooks Falls. As I said in the video, I mean, it really does look easy, but it takes a tremendous amount of practice to do it well, to get it right. And a lot of our more popular bears at Brooks River, at least on the bear camps, will fish the lip of Brooks Falls. So you can look for Grazer to do it, Popeye, for instance. He's already been standing up there this year. Number 806 has done it, in the past, although she has a cub this year, so we might not see her, up at the top of the falls. But yeah, that is maybe one of the most iconic scenes in all of national parks, and it really does highlight a lot of the skill necessary to make a living here. But when we're considering where bears fish at the river, how they fish here, and some of the decisions that go into those behaviors, I mean bears are making choices a lot when they're here about where to fish, but they're also making choices that kind of are more broad than Brooks River itself, in my opinion. And that happens to be choices about where they will fish when salmon aren't here at Brooks River, because this isn't the only game in town, Leon. This is just one of a few spots where bears can fish, especially in the middle of summer. So come August, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for bears to fish in different locations. So salmon in particular are just so important to these bears here at Brooks River, but Katmai National Park contains one of the densest concentrations of brown bears really anywhere on Earth. And that wouldn't happen if salmon were available just in one place at one time. Really what makes part of Katmai so special and allows this ecosystem to support so many brown bears is that salmon are available to bears for a wide breadth of the summer, starting here at Brooks River, maybe in late June and early July, but continuing really into October. We'll have bears fishing here then, but in between, bears are fishing in a lot of different spots. And studies across the Bristol Bay region have found that bears are really kind of riding a wave of salmon, moving from place to place. They learn through experience, maybe their mother's teaching as well, and remembering those lessons about where she took her cubs. Bears will probably into adulthood, and they're able to ride this wave of fish from place to place to place throughout the year. And that's why we can have such an incredible density of brown bears here in this national park. So when you're seeing brown bears at Brooks River, remember, you're only seeing just a small subset of the more than 2,000 bears that are estimated to live here. But there's one thing that I want to talk about when we're talking sort of about the affluence of Katmai, so to speak, the abundance of this ecosystem, and that happens to be bears of on a day-to-day basis. What the overall numbers of salmon can do to them overall. You were mentioning earlier in the broadcast about sometimes we can have a wall of fish at Brooks Falls, and the river just looks like it is more fish than water. It's really incredible to see. We haven't quite seen that yet, but I think it's coming. Salmon just are a little bit late this year, so don't panic. The salmon are definitely on their way. They're just a little bit later than usual this year. So sometimes people will wonder, and it's a bit of a common question. When you see that wall of fish, sometimes you won't see many bears fishing at Brooks Falls, and people would just be scratching their heads. And I did it too at first. I'm like, well, why aren't we seeing a lot of bears here? And again, it has to go back to that bears are hungry animals, but they're not infinitely hungry. They have a finite capacity to their stomachs. So when we do see really high densities of salmon at Brooks Falls and bears are getting extremely well fed, then they can come into the water, they can grab their fill within a few minutes, and then they can leave, and then they just go digest those earnings. When bears have to work harder, though, when there are fewer fish in the river, like what we're seeing right now, we're probably going to see more bears fishing at the falls for longer periods of time. So it's almost a bit counterintuitive when you see that dynamic, but it sort of makes sense on an energy economics standpoint, to go back to that idea once again. When there's a lot of salmon in the river, bears get fed really easily. They don't have to spend a lot of time fishing. When there's not a lot of fish available, then bears are going to spend quite a bit more time fishing. So watch for that too as we progress through July. And I mentioned bears are hungry, not infinitely so. That doesn't mean they're not going to eat a lot of fish. They're definitely going to eat tons of salmon. So Leon, let's talk about just how many salmon a bear can eat.
Oh, sure. How many salmon can a bear eat? It sounds like the beginning of a joke, but really, we have seen bears eat so much. And one of the things about these cams is that it allows us to see a lot more than you would necessarily see. So we're thinking about, on a good day for some of these bigger guys, maybe 30 plus fish. Think of like 747 or 480 sitting there and catching just fish after fish after fish, and it almost seems like there is no end to that. But as Mike said, there definitely is a limit, but we've seen that quite frequently, 30 plus. However, on average, most of Katmai's bears probably aren't going to eat that total of 30 plus a day. But during the right fishing conditions, really productive times, easily dozens of fish. And if you think about perhaps some of our bears, when you see them in springtime and when you see them in fall, you can definitely see that difference. They are definitely putting on that weight, sometimes gaining 2 to 4 pounds or so a day. And, that's why we have that fat bear contest, that fat bear week at the end, because you really can see a difference about how important it is and how much they really are consuming. But to quantify things, it's really hard to do. And while there have been no studies done in Katmai about how much these bears are eating annually, there was a study done in Kodiak. And so Kodiak bears, they are considered a subspecies of brown bears, but they are exceptionally similar to our bears here, a little bit bigger in size. And so that study was done using hair samples and mercury to see how much estimated that those bears are eating over the course of a year. And adult male bears were found to be eating up of 6,000 pounds of salmon. And, when you think about perhaps each salmon is maybe 5 pounds or so, you guys can do the math on how much that might be.
It's an incredible amount.
Yeah. And then adult female bears, they were eating less, about half that much, just over 3,000 pounds or so. And so, yes, that study was definitely done in Kodiak, but it might give us some ideas about how much maybe our bears are eating annually in terms of that. But when you think about salmon and how important it is, again, stressing that they really do need to eat a huge amount in a short amount of time before they enter the den in hibernation, when they're not going to be eating anything but existing solely off of those fat reserves. And in springtime too, when they exit, it's a really lean time then for bears. And so they might be eating overwintered berries or acid. But that's really not enough to sustain them. So during that time, they are often still losing weight and relying on those fat reserves. But it's also, when you think about it, really important for reproductive success, right? So when you think about reproductive success, bears use a strategy called delayed implantation. And so this means that that fertilized egg or embryo isn't going to implant immediately. Instead, it might not even happen. But if it does, it is closer to that time they head into the den. And whether it happens or not is based on definitely how much fat that sow has is definitely a factor in that. So when you think about bears eating, yes, as female bears, they're eating for themselves, but they also, it's important in terms of reproductive success and getting pregnant in the first place. But also, once those cubs are born, she will need to support them and nourish them from her own fat reserves too. So overall, we can't stress how much it is important for these bears to be eating large amounts before they head in for winter time. And yes, we have definitely been talking about fish and fishing techniques because here that is their primary food source. But bears are highly adaptive and they can really take advantage of everything that their environment has around them. So, Mike, can you tell us more about bears and how they might be opportunists in that way?
They're certainly opportunists, and we're going to try to get to a couple of viewer questions here in just a moment as we wind up or conclude our broadcast today. But yeah, Leon, the bears. I mean, I mentioned at the very beginning of the broadcast, if a bear is anything, it's hungry. But if a bear is also something else, besides hungry, they are also opportunists. So look for that on the cameras as well. We've talked about how salmon are extremely important to brown bears during this broadcast, and that is certainly true. It's really difficult to overstate the importance of salmon to brown bears in this ecosystem. But that's not the only thing that they're going to eat. They're going to certainly go for herbaceous vegetation in the springtime because some of that can be quite nutritious, and some smaller bears can actually gain weight on that herbaceous vegetation. They're going to go after berries later in the year as those ripen, especially on Dumpling Mountain behind us. That's a place where bears will go foraging for blueberries and crowberries. But then there's also other opportunities for them that we've seen on the cameras already this year, like chasing after a beaver, hunting beavers, and actually being successful. There was a bear that did that in the riffles just maybe a couple of weeks ago or so. So yeah, it's kind of amazing to see how adaptable the animals are, how opportunistic they are. And last year, maybe one of the better examples of that happened to be the bear that was catching gulls and doing that successfully, going for some birds instead of while it was fishing for salmon. That was kind of amazing to see. So look for those opportunities because that is one thing that bears are so good at. They're so good at exploiting opportunities. And Leon, it was great to have you on the broadcast today, co-hosting along with me. It's great for me to be back here at Brooks River. I'm really eager to spend some more time here over the next couple of weeks. We have a live broadcast planned almost every day while I'm here, either with yourself or with Ranger Naomi, who's working behind the scenes right now to keep things running smooth for us. Before we actually get to our official conclusion of the broadcast, so you want to grab a couple of viewer questions?
Sure.
All right. Waiting for our questions to come up on the screen, though, but I do not have them. Oh, any predictions? Okay. Any predictions about how the 2021 salmon run will go?
Sure. Well, I mean, compared to last year, right? Last year was an incredible year, and we might have gotten a little spoiled about that record breaking run. But this year, it is still predicted to be higher than average. So, yes, perhaps just a little later than usual in terms of recent years, but not uncommonly late.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. It's just late in coming right now. So, you know, we see the Bears not catching a lot of fish right now, not having a lot of success. We actually planned this broadcast for July 2nd because we thought, oh, we're certainly will see a lot of bears catching fish by now because that's what we've been seeing during the last few years. But nature rarely works on an exact schedule. So we're just seeing a little bit of a delay. But I think we're going to see another strong salmon run this year. The other watersheds in the Bristol Bay area have started to see large returns already. It's just a little bit delayed for the Naknek River right now. Mike, who was the first bear you spotted on an arrival? That's an interesting question. So I've recognized several bears while I've been here so far. I wouldn't say several, but at least two or three. The one that was here most recently, right before we were starting our broadcast, was number 284. and her two cubs. They were on the other side of the river. We got a good look at her. Holly was upstream of us with her yearling. It was really great to see her. She is one of those bears that is wonderful to watch, and I'm looking forward to also looking at some of the smaller bears that they're kind of hard to learn while you're just watching the webcams. And some of our webcam audience, Leon, is really incredible at identifying those younger bears. But
I am impressed. It's hard for me to do even in person, let alone via the webcam.
So I'm certainly looking forward to learning more about those individual bears while I'm here and sharing my experiences watching them with everybody. And Leon, at what age do the cubs start to participate in fishing?
I think cubs in general, you'll often see them mimicking mom. Whether or not they're very successful, we definitely see it pretty young.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not probably, for the very young cubs, for the first year cubs, probably not something that we're going to see right now. But later in the year, they're definitely going to be scavenging for mom's salmon, or watching her and being like, you know what, there's also dead salmon over there. Can do that too. But they quickly develop a taste for salmon. It seems like as soon as they stop being freaked out by mom running around with this weird thing in their mouth, because we'll sometimes see that, like with a spring cub. They'll come to the river for the first time. Mom catches a fish. They've never seen mother do it, and they're like, "What is going on? This is weird." And then they see their mom eating it, and they're like, "Oh, maybe that's something good for me." So they quickly develop a taste for salmon. By the end of the year, they're certainly going to be scavenging for salmon, and the yearling cubs are at this time of the year going to be mostly relying on mom, but they're definitely going to be looking for fishing opportunities as well, as best they can. But later in the year, it's going to get a lot easier for cubs of all ages to scavenge salmon. And maybe we'll try to get to just one more question here. And how do bears digest salmon bones, or do they not eat them? See, that is something I've pondered as well. It seems like they don't digest many of the bones.
It doesn't. Yes, it doesn't seem so.
Yeah, when we look at their scat, when they're eating a lot of salmon, it can be just full of bones. It's basically just a splat of diarrhea with salmon bones in it. So it's not that pleasant. It doesn't smell that pleasant, but it does demonstrate that they will pass those bones through their gut. Even the jaw bones, the mandibles of the salmon, and I'm talking about jaw bones that are about as long as mine, passing through their gut somehow, sometimes, which is kind of amazing to me that they can tolerate that sort of thing. But yeah, also the ribs, the vertebra as well. A lot of the smaller, softer bones, they're probably drawing some nutrition out of that through the digestion process, maybe calcium and stuff like that. But yeah, it just seems to pass right on through them. We're sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions. I'm sure there were many more about bear fishing styles. We'll be happy to try to answer those during another broadcast or during any of our Q&As that we lined up. So please check out our live event schedule for the rest of July. We have a ton of stuff going on during the next couple weeks, especially, and throughout the rest of the month. Leon, it's been great to talk to you today.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank the National Park Service for allowing me to come back out the Brooks River and to share this experience with everybody who is watching the webcams at home. But just remember, when you're watching bears fishing for salmon, I mean, it is a behavior that's driven by hunger, but it's also a behavior that shows a bear's adaptability, their ability to exploit opportunity, their individuality with their different fishing techniques, and also the importance of salmon to bears in this ecosystem. So lots to consider when we're watching bears fishing for salmon, and it'll be a great time, I think, for the next several weeks considering those things. My name is Mike Fitz with Explore